A reading from the Gospel of John, chapter 8, verses 1 through 11. And Jesus went to the Mount of Olives. Early in the morning he returned to the temple. All the people gathered around him, and he sat down and taught them. The legal experts and Pharisees brought a woman caught in adultery. Placing her in the center of the group, they said to Jesus, "Teacher, this woman was caught in the act of committing adultery. In the law, Moses commanded us to stone women like this. What do you say?" They said this to test him because they wanted a reason to bring an accusation against him. Jesus bent down and wrote on the ground with his finger. They continued to question him, so he stood up and replied, "Whoever hasn't sinned should throw the first stone." Bending down again, he wrote on the ground. Those who heard him went away, one by one, beginning with the elders. Finally, only Jesus and the woman were left in the middle of the crowd. Jesus stood up and said to her, "Woman, where are they? Is there no one to condemn you?" She said, "No one, sir." Jesus said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go, and from now on, don't sin anymore."
Let anyone among you who is without sin be the first to throw a stone at her. That wasn't the beginning of her day. Who knows what had happened to her up until that moment? It was the Festival of Tabernacles. Jerusalem was packed. Every Jewish male from near and far was required to journey to Jerusalem. A parade filled the streets as crowds made their way to the temple. By this time in Jesus' life, the scribes and the Pharisees had tried multiple times to have Jesus arrested, and they had failed. They were furious, the eating nails for breakfast kind of furious. In the text read today, the Pharisees devised what they believed to be another foolproof question trap for Jesus. In the scenario presented in the Gospel according to John, a woman would be the pawn this time because women were expendable and certainly not seen as worthy of a name or their own agency. I wish I knew more of her story to honor her. I wonder if she was snatched or sold or yanked through the streets. And by the way, where is the man that she was supposedly committing adultery with? While we don't know her story or what had happened to her in moments before, perhaps we can imagine it was at this time when she saw the ending of her life flash before her eyes. Whatever wrongdoing she might have committed or that some believe she committed, it called for the most severe punishment. And there they stood, a bunch of religious leaders ready to gang up on her, literally, but also with the intent to catch Jesus in the act of violating the law himself, a sort of 2-for-1 legal game of chicken in which there would be no winning for the woman or for Jesus. As we have seen throughout our sermon series, Out of the Question, the religious leaders loved to test Jesus, trying to trip him up with veiled questions, an epic Wile E. Coyote capturing Roadrunner sort of scenario. This exchange between Jesus and the religious leaders and the woman was no different, except that the stakes were pretty high. They involved a stoning. Now, there are a couple of things worth noticing about this accusation and exchange. The law the religious leaders were referring to is found in a couple of places in the Old Testament, in Deuteronomy 22 and Leviticus 20, which both deal with adultery and stoning, but with the qualifier that the adulterer and the adulteress will be put to death. Turns out that Jewish law required that there be at least 2 witnesses to the act of adultery. But that day, the scribes and Pharisees with Jesus were actually concerned about upholding or following the law. They had no interest in a formal trial, only an accusation and then a question. What do you say, Jesus? Now let's consider this. If Jesus didn't uphold the law, what he said about fulfilling the law would be seen as a sham or a lie. But if he upheld the law and colluded with the stoning, that would not be consistent with Jesus' embodied ethics of love, mercy, and compassion. It was all on the line that day for Jesus and the unnamed woman. How did Jesus respond? Verse 6, Jesus bent down, wrote with his finger on the ground. Wait, what? With the potential stoning on the line, he wrote in the sand? Bold move, Jesus. We don't actually know what he wrote in the sand, but that's secondary to the words that came next. Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw the stone. Notice what Jesus didn't say. He didn't say, don't throw any stones, but instead, make sure the one who throws the stone is without sin. Jesus, in that moment, trapped the trappers, turned the tables, and put back on the accusers, saying in essence, you want to apply the law? Then let's apply it. It was a brilliant move. I'm thinking that Jesus would have done well in the game of Survivor in the outwit part. But Jesus didn't deny the law that day. In fact, he applied the law, and no one dared pick up a stone. Then Jesus went back to writing on the ground. Again, we don't know what he wrote. It doesn't really matter. With the religious leaders ready to pounce, he ignored them. All good for Jesus. But again, I'm wondering what the woman was thinking. Jesus, on the other hand, seems disinterested in their little show, like a kid playing in the dirt during a t-ball game. Then in verse 9, we learn that the scribes and Pharisees went away one by one, and the focus now turns from the accusers to the accused. Jesus stood, looked at the woman, and questioned her. Where are they? Where are your accusers? You may notice this is the first time in the whole exchange that anyone addressed the woman. She had been dragged in, shamed and publicly humiliated, accused of adultery and tried without a jury, about to be sentenced to death by a stoning. But up until then, no one had even spoken to her. And when he did, Jesus didn't start with assumptions or accusations about what she had done or not done. He instead treated her with dignity and respect, saw her humanity. He didn't reduce her to an object or someone simply to pity. Public theologian and pastor Nadia Bolz-Weber wrote that we must reject the temptation to view others with pity instead of compassion, because pity is just the paternalistic cousin of contempt, seeing others as simply less fortunate than ourselves, keeping the othering going and people at a distance. Compassion, on the other hand, draws us close, draws us in. Jesus did that day with the woman when he acknowledged her, seeing even just a fraction of her pain and acknowledging how it is like his and very much not like his own pain and experience. Seeing no witnesses against her, Jesus questions her again. Has no one condemned you? The woman replied, no one. Now, she is not required to present a defense to recount the traumatic events she has just endured. She is not questioned or interrogated, and there is no further victimizing of her. Jesus responds to the woman, neither do I condemn you. This from the rabbi, the man tasked with acting as judge, declaring that the charges against her have been proven invalid, since none of those who sought to bring them were willing to stand by their claims. Significant here are his choice of words. The Greek word for condemn is a decisive word. It means to be judged and deserving of a legal penalty, or to put explicitly, to be found guilty of the crime. In the text, Jesus is speaking still within a legal framework, explicitly stating that the charges against her are baseless, and she is declared not guilty. And that brings us to the most misunderstood words in this passage. Go and sin no more. Now you may be scratching your head, wondering here why, if the woman is not guilty, did Jesus say, go and sin no more? If Jesus had just made the legal proclamation that the woman is deemed not guilty, why then would he say, you got away with it this time and you need to stop doing it? It would radically undermine the events that had just taken place with the religious leaders. If his opponents sought to trap him by getting him to either violate the law or defy Rome, then his stating, you're guilty, but I'm letting you go anyway, would give those leaders precisely what they were seeking. Jesus' allegiance to two apparently contradictory laws, the Jewish and the Roman, are put to the test by the scribes and the Pharisees. In this interaction, in response to the woman, he does not support one against the other, but rather exposes both biased systems and purity codes. Most often, in the literal interpretation of this passage in John, it's seen as a judgment against the unnamed woman and Jesus simply offering her an act of mercy. Now, if I asked you to look up this passage in your Bible, it's likely that there's a notation in the text in chapter 8 with a note that says, the earliest manuscripts do not include chapter 7, verses 53 through chapter 8, verses 11. You see, the ideas embedded in this story are deeply cultural, but they're not actually biblical. In fact, most scholars think this passage was not original to John's gospel, but added later by the early church. The story is also known by its Latin name, the pericope adulterae, which is a pericope derived from the Greek word for cutting around. So in early scriptural terms, the story is literally a patch, a piece of text sewn into what later would become the New Testament. It's found in the Gospel of John, where it started popping up in the 4th and 5th centuries and seemed plausible enough that nobody even questioned it until the 19th century. In the most prevalent reading of this text, which can be traced back to Augustine, it's a watered-down Jesus as the embodiment of grace and the woman as an embodiment of sin. We know that framework plays out throughout Scripture based on time and context. But now, here and now, we have the opportunity and perhaps the obligation to reread this story, and the story also in the Gospel of John of the Samaritan woman in a new light. The Greek words used in the passage, go and sin no more, really matter. Mekite harmatane. In Greek, when combined, these words mean approximately, do not act in a way that would make you guilty of violating the law. Therefore, Jesus is not admonishing this woman for sinful actions, but advising her to be careful not to give the religious authorities any reason to accuse her for going forward. Jesus isn't speaking to the woman's sins at all, but to the unjust purity laws and system in which the woman doesn't stand a chance. Jesus, more than anyone, knew how tricky it can be to try to exist within an unfair law, especially unjust ones. This was the same Jesus who said, I came not to abolish the law, but to fulfill it. The law, the one that Jesus embodied, is based in dignity and worth and justice. It was a law that brings people into love of God, not a law based on false notions of purity and worth that sought to exclude and keep people on the margins and away from God. If we stayed on the surface of Jesus' question and follow-up statement, go and sin no more, it could be interpreted as his practicing grace, granting mercy, and absolving guilt simply on a divine whim. And while that might make for a nicer sermon or more palpable Jesus, it stops short of the Jesus I know and the one you know too. The Jesus who turns tables in the temple, the one who stood up and spoke out against injustice, who sat down and ate with those who were excluded, who washed feet as a servant and rode a donkey. To make Jesus' response to the woman an act of divine mercy falls short of a Jesus who challenged and changed the political and religious ideologies of his day. The story, the question, and response are not about purity or pity or cheap grace, or a Jesus who picks and chooses when to dole out forgiveness or hold those responsible for the accusations responsible. That simplified reading would reinforce shame and guilt and condemnation, and that simply doesn't hold up to the Jesus we know. In our modern world, That would be as if Jesus were saying that white supremacists and the victims of racism are equally condemned, because the issue is sin and both are sinful. In this line of thinking, the rapist and the victim of rape, the abuser and those they abuse, are all one and the same. To settle for that interpretation undermines the radical and the transformative nature of Jesus' actions that day, and makes him into some sort of superhero that sweeps in to rescue and let the unjust off the hook for the harm they've done. If we simply defaulted to Jesus' grace in this moment without regard for the unjust law that he too was existing within, and the authorities who tried their best to trap and trip him up, that theology would leave all persons accused and accusers as equally sinful and at fault for injustice, and that would be harmful. It would also fail to take seriously the legal setting of this scene and the weight that it gives to Jesus' words, "I do not condemn you." In his question to the woman, the issue wasn't based on her innocence or guilt. In fact, his words to her legally pronounce her innocence. But in choosing to use the words "makite harmatain," Jesus pointed out the hypocrisy of the corrupt religious and political systems and authorities. That Jesus in John 8 is an upstander and challenges the methods of religious leaders who speak as if they are the holders of moral authority, deeming people worthy or not of the love of God. The Jesus we see in this text, if we really look, is a Jesus who liberates rather than colludes, and who challenges and changes how we see the law and one another. This Jesus came and showed us a new way of living and a new way of loving, gave us a new commandment and a different kind of law. As my colleague, the Reverend Canon Broderick Greer of St. John's Cathedral, downtown Denver, once said, "If theology can be used to oppress, murder, and brutalize people, then why can't theology be used to liberate us, dignify us, and renew us?" My friends, it has to be. The reality is that the Bible is not a neutral text. These are texts written thousands of years ago and patched in, but for what purpose and who gets to control the narrative? It's not far away in our own collective history that we too built cultural norms on false ideas of purity and religiosity. I have my own story about purity and religious authority, and maybe you do too. To be clear, there was no stoning at stake. I was 12. Our youth choir at St. James United Methodist Church was about to go on tour for our Tell It Like It Is musical. The pastor stopped by the church during our final rehearsal to pray and send us forth. During this one song, Rosy Tinted Glasses, we all put on sunglasses as a prop. During the break, our pastor pulled the adult leaders aside, told them, and then proceeded to tell the youth that under no circumstances were we to wear sunglasses in the sanctuary. Now, being a curious child with an instinct to question most things, especially when it came to God, I asked in the most respectful way I could, "Why can't we wear sunglasses in church? That's not in the Bible. They didn't even have sunglasses back then." Our pastor, bless his heart, generally good-spirited about my big questions and challenges, said, "Well, Amy, it's disrespectful to God." "How so?" I quipped back. "If God can see in our hearts, then it doesn't matter what we wear, right?" I'm sure there was some eye-rolling on both of our parts. And Reverend Coble never forgot that interaction and was one of the first to stand in support of my ordination. Because that day it wasn't about being right or even trying to trip one another up, but an example of how we make up religious beliefs about purity and truth, who's in, who's out, what's offensive to God, what's right and wrong, with no basis in Jesus' actual words or teachings, but only through the lens of our own cultural norms, opinions, which often become the basis for unjust legalism and judgment. Do you remember when wedding dresses had to be white or the bride was considered scandalous? Or when divorce and remarriage without an annulment could lead to excommunication from one's religious community? Or how gays and lesbians could be denied membership, communion, or baptism in churches? Or how interracial marriage was criminalized? Jesus' response to the woman that day made clear that in the essence of law, purity isn't the aim. It's not based on some imposed social or religious moral code. When he said, "Go and sin no more," it was a warning that injustice is still alive and well. But his words and response were also a blessing to the unnamed woman and to us. An invitation to live in a new way, where love is the basis of the law, and how we treat one another with compassion becomes our measure. Through his questions and response, Jesus opens the eyes of both the oppressors and the oppressed, bringing them and us to see a new reality in what's possible. And in seeing this way, we cannot unsee. For we are presented today not just with a question from Jesus to consider, but a choice. How will we respond when put to the test? With legalism or with love? Our takeaways for today are simply this. Religious beliefs about purity, who's in, who's out, who's right, who's wrong, have no basis in Jesus' actual words or teachings. Jesus is the one who liberates rather than colludes, and who challenges and changes how we see one another and the law. And finally, love is the basis of the law, and compassion is our measure. May it be so.